So we talk about hermeneutics, and we talk about what I already mentioned, that there is an intrinsic link to philology, the love of the word, the love of region, or in more constricted sense of logos, of language, of text, textual studies, philology. And here we're basically defining philology as the critical study of text. Text doesn't need to be written, it can be painted, it can be composed as music and so on. Then we have basically three layers always. The one is what you could say the material layer, that has to do with if it's a printed text or a manuscript text, it has the text itself. Then the semiotic system it contains, which we can in written text, if we're talking about writing, we talk about language, but it can we talk about in music, we talk about the form of the keys and the different ways of notations and annotations and so on. So the way, the medium, how from the material we come to the content, or what is the third level, the understanding, the meanings. So, but if we keep it with a textual thing, with a written text, then here we have the level of language. So the symbolic systems through which meaning is mediated, and then we have finally the level of understanding of the content of meaning. And when we talk about philology, hermeneutics, then we have to walk through these layers, obviously, to arrive to something. I will talk about what hermeneutics means a little bit. I'll start with philology. So if we talk about the layer of the text itself, then we would, as philologists, would first need to look at how do we establish a text. If you talk about a painting, for instance, how do we know? We first have to establish a provenance. If we talk about a written text, we need to, for instance, a text of Virgil's Aeneid, then we need to collect manuscripts and compare the manuscripts and see what right? And it's even true for Shakespeare, or even true for contemporary authors who sometimes have autographs versions, and then they destroy the autograph versions, or they make one authorized version. If we talk about film, you have the commercial cut of a film, but you also get director's cut, and you got all the raw material of the filmed sequences and so on, and you get possibilities of different arrangements. If you have a musical composition, you transpose something from which was written for a harpsichord onto the piano. You have all these kind of things. So you make a choral piece out of a quintet, or these are all different ways of collecting and reading and maybe or re-establishing new editions of a text. Yeah, so we need to. It's basically it's about establishing editions. And with a written text, when we keep talking about Virgil's, for instance, Aeneid, then we call it critical editions because we looked at manuscripts and we compared them, and we saw we can have a way of saying, well, this might be a mistake made by a scribe and so on. We have to go according to certain criteria to establish what is the most probable. Text. It doesn't mean that we should aim for a fictionist author copy or a fictionist first edition, but we aim for a best guess, right, to be established. Because otherwise, when we are talking about interpreting Virgil's Aeneid, we might be talking about a couple of verses, and there might be different versions of that. right? And so one person would be talking about that, another about that, according to the manuscripts they're using. So we need to have at least some sort of common ground. So that's the process of text criticism, critical editions. Similarly, if it is establishing the score of a musical piece and so on. Then on the level of the language, obviously everything that is mediated is that whether that's musical annotations, whether that is fine art language, or it is spoken language or written language, there is a process of translating going on. And here, Ferdinand Saussure, the famous structuralist in the beginning of the 20th century, he introduced this difference between parole. This is why it's French words. Yeah, it's because of a French-Swiss scholar. Parole versus la langue. Yeah, and so parole would mean here on the level of the language that is the vehicle of communication and meaning, versus la langue, which is simply the language as linguistic system. So la langue is the basically can be best described through grammatical systems, versus the grammar of la langue is only the first step through which we then go to parole. Yeah, that's the vehicle of meaning. All right, and we're talking especially here. The easiest to understand is to understand it as a in the system of different languages. It also works in your native tongue, because you also need to have some sort of a translation going on if you read Shakespeare, for instance. But even if you read early 20th century or Victorian novels, there is also a difference into how contemporary English is spoken and just 100 years ago, right? But if you think of it more as like translating, for instance, from French to English, or from Latin to English, or from Greek to English, or from Sanskrit, anywhere in Chinese, then it's good to have this differentiation between la langue as the system of linguistic symbols versus parole as the vehicle of communication that can be described through la langue. You have on the most basic level, and again the view from how to when we make an effort to learn a second and third and fourth and so on language is obviously we put these nexus of sound of meaning into an artificial system that we create in order to work through acquiring la langue, and that is grammar, which looks on the way we speak, that is phonetics, the sounds. The sounds in English varieties are very, very different. The difference between Peter and Peter. So to have a alveolar occlusive in British English, where we have a flap in American English. Right? So that is phonetics. Phonetics can teach us that. Then you have morphology, and that means how language is organized in the more simple ways of morphology. You would have languages that have more or less no morphology whatsoever, or very, very rudimentary. Like in Chinese, you can mark a plural with certain words, and that you can say is morphology. But the verb, for instance, don't changes, and the nouns don't changes, and to a certain degree in Chinese, for instance, the distinction between verb and nouns don't make sense, right? So but classically, because it comes from classical philology and Indo-European languages, you would always look at phonetics, morphology, and syntax. And morphology would then be looking at how certain words change according to certain contexts. So if you want to mark a plural, we use S in English. We don't have so many case changes anymore, but we have for in some cases the difference between she and her, and so on, you know. And in more in less analytical, we call it analytical when languages are organizing themselves a little bit more according to the word orders and using certain analytical particles rather than having the morphological changes within the words. So more analytical languages like English, the inward morphology is less pronounced, and then it becomes more complex on the level of syntax of the third level. And syntax is how actually the different words are put together in a sentence, or to make units, not only a sentence, but phrases and clauses and sentences, and actually also larger structures, which we then call macrosyntax. Now, so these are all things that we need to reflect on the level of the second level, on the language. And if we don't have the native language, we need to learn that in a second and third language. And if we are native speakers and we are working with text, we have to be aware of them in our own language. And then we need to be aware about what I already mentioned, diachrony and synchrony. So the historical development of language, and this is not always straightforward, you know. If you look at the development from Anglo-Saxon to contemporary English, this is very, very unstraightforward, you know. You have focus on different regions in the Anglo-Saxon literature, like in the Beowulf is the Old Kentish, but Middle English is not a direct development from Old Kentish. Let go all the influence of the Norman conquest, you know, where all the French and then the Old French and the Latin stuff comes in. Not only that, but also regionally. So the same with Sanskrit, you know, Vedic Sanskrit is not the direct ancestor to classical Sanskrit, and classical Sanskrit is not the direct ancestor to the Middle Indian Prakrits, and the Prakrits are not direct ancestors to the new Indian languages. They are always shifting, they change according to shifting political and other contexts. You can see that in the development of high languages in the Germanic case, very, very easily in the case of Dutch, you know, which Middle Dutch, or you could say, we don't even call it Middle Dutch, we can call it Middle Dutch, is actually basically a Middle German dialect. It's Middle Franconian, Middle Western Franconian, and only when the Netherlands gain a certain form of political sovereignty, Dutch develops to become a high language. That means it becomes hegemonous of our kind of dialects around, and it develops a written language with its own independence. And at that point, actually, you can start to differentiate between German dialects and Dutch as a separate language. But it's all quite arbitrary, and it's all about who has the power. Yeah? Middle High German was very much relying on the Staufen Empire. When the center of Staufia, of the Staufian Empire, changed, which is somehow of Swabian, the modern German is based on Luther's Bible translation, and that has had a Saxonian background. So you know, there is no direct. When you read the Middle High German epics, you know, they don't in any linear way lead to early High German literature, right? Because they're shifting regional powers who codify high languages that become written languages and so on. And according to their rise and fall, also. We get the diachronic development. So you need to know a little bit about that. And on a synchronic level, Did you wanted to ask something, or was it okay? Yeah, so it's always okay to ask. Yeah, we are so informal here. Yeah. On the synchronic level, I mean, yeah, we could use this example that I gave earlier about how a toff speaks and how a blue collar person speaks. But you find that also in the way of there are genres in literature that use different what we call registers. Comedy, for instance. If you take Greek comedy, Aristophanes, you have always the comic relief there that speaks in a specific dialect that marks them as low caste or working class or somehow ruffian or somehow farmers and so on. And that these are different registers of language, while the choir, for instance, in both in the comedy and in the Attic tragedy, they speak a specific Greek dialect, the Doric dialect, which marks them as some sort of another genre marker for a specific register, and so on. So and you have again shifting centers of power that compete for hegemony, also linguistic hegemony, and then sometimes reflect also in literary language and regional dialects, as we have in Old Greek, which basically becomes codified in the genre. In epos you have a specific mix of Ionic, Aeolic dialect coming from Homer down to the late imperial epics, which becomes then very literary. The tragedies are in Ionic Greek or Attic Ionic Greek, with the choir speaking in Doric. You have then the codified classical Attic in all the rhetorical works and then the philosophical works and so on. But now in the age of Wikipedia, we have also a drive away from high language. So you get Wikipedia in different dialects of German. You get Wikipedia in different dialects of Italian and so on. This regionalism is coming back. And I haven't checked for the different dialects of Britain, but I think at least Scots also, which is like a heavily Gaelic influenced form of English, has its own Wikipedia now, and so and there's a drive of making them written languages. Again, the moment you start with writing down dialects, you also codify some sort of lingua franca or some center of this dialect, because there's no dialect is also solidified and stable, I mean, the village I come from spoke a different Ripuarian dialect than the next village and so on. But there is now something like literary Ripuarian, which is focusing on the dialect of the city of Cologne. So there are all these movements going on. And then the third layer is then actually what I was supposed to be talking about, but I'm talking so much about the other things because there's so much to talk about. It's also interesting, and that is hermeneutics, understanding or looking for meaning in a text. And I'm saying meaning and not the meaning, but looking for meaning in a text. That is what hermeneutics means, and there's a difference between a more narrower view of hermeneutics that is pointing to text itself, whether that's a painting or a piece of music or a book or a poem, and what then develops into a form of philosophy, of an approach of philosophy, which we call philosophical hermeneutics. And if I have the time and you have the patience, then I will talk about that a little bit. But first I like to show you a picture of Hermes with an erect penis. Looking for meaning in some sort of a text, we can't call it a theory of interpretation, a theory of translation of meaning, because hermeneuo in Greek, in Old Greek, means to translate and to interpret both. And that is very important to understand, that every interpretation is a translation. It derives from Hermes, the Greek messenger god, whom we see here, right? And his main function was to translate the will of the gods for the humans, because the divine will of language, if you want, of the gods were not clearly directly understandable. He was also the god who protected the thieves in the night and the ones who go around reveling. If we are thinking through translation and interpretation, hermeneutics as translation and interpretation, then this context, this connection to Hermes, the Greek god, is made clear in Plato, who talks about speech as an imitation of reality. So Plato already points to this nexus of sound and speech we talked about, and he calls imitation mimesis, a mimesis of a reality or of truth. And that obviously fits in with Plato's idea of ideas, notion of ideas that preform our experienced reality and so on. In the Cratylus, that's a dialogue, a nice dialogue of his the Cratylus. He introduces Hermes as the messenger, as the interpreter, but he recognizes the deceiving nature of language, because Hermes conveys the god's wills, but he is also a liar, a thief. The invention of language is an act of lie and thievery, because whatever imitation of reality you try to convey, it's always reduced to the point that it becomes a lie. Right? And we know that from communication theory. If we just write emails to each other, we know that we lose something of context. We lose because we don't see each other. We don't see whether we smile, we don't smile, and so on, and so on. And also, we simply cannot put all the contextually relevant information into this very limited system of language, whether this is a musical system or an artistic system or a textual or speech system. So all interpretation, all translation, speech itself is contingent, and by means of its contingency, it is always deceiving. It is also always a lie. And that also means then that speech is always open. It's not 100% solid, which is a huge annoyance to people who like this kind of ontological or even philological security in their life, that they want to have one-to-one, this is what the author means. Haven't we all got into school, especially early school, and been told, okay, this is what the author means? The complete nonsense, of course, So a text, not speaking of an author at all, but a text is always open for a multiplicity of meanings, just because of this nature of language as a lie, as both an imitation of truth and necessarily also of a lie. So then the language, as far as it carries meaning in its system, signs or symbols, that is then that is parole. And these symbols, they always are both true and deceptions. And that makes working with parole on that level, with texts, with a painting, with a piece of music, so incredibly enriching. But also you need to hold the complexity of it, the tension of its complexity, and have to be able to bear this tension. You will never get the meaning, right? There will never be the translation. And that is difficult for people to grasp. So this is why you have in the area of, for instance, New Testament scholarship, very, very crowded area of hundreds of years of people interpreting the New Testament. You have whole libraries of commentary, for instance, to one particularly small letter by Paul, in talking about it, looking at, commenting upon it, and so on. So you might have a text that takes you 3 minutes or 5 minutes to read through, and then you have a whole library of thousands of pages commenting upon it. Because of that, the complexities of hermeneutics. So this is what we call exegesis, to trying to extract or communicate something having to do with meaning. And exegesis, which tries to look at the complexity of a text and to unravel as most of possible of its contextual significances to a wide variety of people who receive the text, is different than focusing on the significance of the text just for one particular reader, especially the one who interprets it. So I can talk about a certain parable or simile in the New Testament from a historical or context, from a reception context, shifting in different geographies and different eras of times, or I could talk about it from what it means to me. They are both forms of, hermeneutics, but only one of them is called exegesis. The other we could call actually more eisegesis, reading into the text, So if you just read a text and then you say, well, for me that means that. That is basically taking a text and running it for your own life, for your own context, right? But exegesis means that you at least make an effort to understand more about the diachronic and synchronic context, right? So all these things, to a certain degree, have already been worked through by the early philologists, and it wasn't by mistake that I quoted the New Testament, because much of it comes from the interpretation of the Christian pith texts, you could say. So Martin Luther reflected on philology already and talked about the dangers of the philological circle, where you would, for instance, privilege an element of the text above the whole of a text, so which basically meaning is to extracting one unit and then decontextualize it and blow it up. And that is what we find very often in literary interpretations and fundamentalist interpretations of Holy Scripture always, that people focus on an element, take it out of the context and blow it up and make it relevant to a degree that it had never a certain relevance before. In mainstream religions, that happened, for instance, with the Jewish dietary laws. You know, there's one sentence in Leviticus: "Thou shalt not cook the baby goat in the milk of the mother goat." That is the whole Tanakhical or Toraic basis for the huge dietary law in Judaism, that you cannot mix dairy products with meat products. So, although contextually this meant just literary, it was probably also a proverb. It's something like, you know, don't separate things that are really, really close and important, you know. But you know, it became this huge in casuistics, and these legalistic casuistics of the early Second Temple theologies. It became all this huge dietary law, and you know, you see that in fundamentalist Christianity up to today. You know, that people, you know, they don't have a problem apparently preaching prosperity gospel. There's something that is against the spirit and so many letters in the Gospels, but where so many talks about the poor and so on, you know, completely ignoring that, but then taking out of context willy-nilly some of the things that they find in social conservatism, for instance, that they find fitting with their agenda. And here we have this problem. If you go into this kind of pretend you're doing hermeneutics or exegesis, but you're simply doing eisegesis. You're just selecting something and then talking about what it means to yourself, you know. Anyway, we don't need to go further in, but then we have just in the history of hermeneutics. So Martin Luther talked already about the philological circle, and how the elements of a text relate to the whole of the text, or in other words, text can only exist by contextualization. And if you decide not to contextualize, you actually do. You just simply, you basically make a decision to ignore contexts and privilege your own context. All right? So there is no text without context. Right? And also Friedrich Schleiermacher already, the German theologian and philosopher of religion of the 18th, 19th century, looked at hermeneutics as understanding basically the meaning of a discourse. So he separated already text from the author. Again, something that some secondary school teachers could learn from, you know, who ask you, what does the author mean by that? The author, I'm very radical in that. I say, well, the author never means anything. There might be a representation of an author in the text, but this is not the same as the author. You know, I can write a book, you know, from the perspective of a terrible person. Okay, or in my case, since I'm a terrible person, from the perspective of a saint. And it's still the author that I represent me as, like when I talk a narrative about how I became studying Greek, you know. This doesn't need to be matching with who I am, you know. I can represent myself as a saint in my writings, although everybody who knows me know that I'm a terrible person, and so on. So we need to differentiate between text and even the possible representation of an author in a text, and the author who lives and breathes and goes to the toilet and has happy thoughts and unhappy thoughts like everybody else, a human being, contingent human being, right? in many ways, and if you look at Joyce, for instance, how his self-mystification as an author has obliterated actually the historical Joyce that he was, and so on. So it's all. But we find that already at Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher already was aware of this kind of, that you need to differentiate. And you had some, in literary criticism, you have these fads, and one fad, especially in the 50s and 60s, everybody were doing like psychology, biographical psychology of texts, So if something was there in Shakespeare, people would say, well, oh yeah, he had this experience in life, and so on. And this is very dubious when you think through this kind of, yes, there is a link, obviously, but there is never a one-to-one equivalent. And sometimes even really smart authors, they can pretend there might be links, but there aren't links. This is just complete, representing yourself in the text, or not representing anybody in the text. Right? So, okay, Schleiermacher, or however you want to pronounce him in English. So in German he's pronounced Schleiermacher, or you can say Schleiermacher or whatever. Yeah, Schleiermacher. Friedrich Schleiermacher. Yeah. But then you become too smart and you talk about the person and people don't recognize it because they only recognize the English pronunciation. It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah? But anyway, so Schleiermacher, and then you had August Böck, a father of modern philology, who then introduced these areas of interpretation, kind of working through stages 2 and 3, grammar, and then language or particularity, and then the historical and the synchronic context. So in the early 19th century, and you got people like Willem Dilthey who make a differentiation between what hermeneutics or looking for meaning and interpretation means within the context of the humanities versus the context of the exact science. Humanities going for understanding of issues while exact science going for explaining. That's Dilthey. It doesn't need to be very clear cut. Actually, in many ways, it's not clear cut. It might be clear cut if you take the most mathematical of exact science, maybe like some forms of physics, and compare it to literary criticism. But if you go into biology, for instance, it's not actually so clear between understanding and explaining. If you go to social science, again, it's not so clear. But you get people who think through these problems, what translating and theories of knowledge and producing knowledge in the way of interpreting and translating means. You can think of physics as a sort of translating the natural world, into a system. You can think of mathematics, of translating certain mechanics that you find in the natural world, And again, maybe mathematics and physics imitates reality to a greater degree than a novel does. But there's also, even there, is always a degree of lie and duplicity. Mathematical theorems are only true until they are disproved at some point or refined and so on. So we have this kind of endless way of in physics, we go from Newton's physics to quantum mechanics to new physics. New physics also challenging quantum mechanics to a certain degree. And so what comes after new physics, we don't know. Maybe it's the alien octopus physics. I don't know. There will be some sort of a degree of development. So it's not that clear cut. But people think about this kind of things, And then, again, and this is the long way from textual hermeneutics that I'm describing now to philosophical hermeneutics, with people like the Italian philosopher and philologist Emilio Betti reflecting on the relationship of the one who interprets or receives, the reader, and the text itself that was produced by an author. And then he talks about the different horizons, you know. If I'm Cicero and I'm writing a speech, I have a very clear context that might be very, very different from the race wars in America, where you have philologists then maybe interpreting the speech, you know. So it's quite interesting. Classical philology being extremely white and extremely traditional, to the degree that we had an incident just 2 weeks ago at a meeting in America where an African American, or was he Latino? I think African American, or a person of color, a classicist, was actually racially abused in a panel by a white woman who objected to him bringing critical race theory into classical studies, you know, and so insisting that Greek and Latin culture, civilization, and literature is the basis for our Western white civilization, these kind of things. While actually race and ethnicity was a very complicated thing in the ancient world. We had people of color, obviously, who had very stratified things and representations of racial diversities and so on. And 50 years ago, nobody wrote about that because it was completely white supremacist discipline. Now people, scholars of color, have been talking about it with seminal publications like Black Athena in the 1980s, 1990s, and so on coming. And those who have a simplistic view on civilization and Western culture are always coming together with white supremacy. They don't like these kind of things, right? So anyway, so here Betty, we talk about the horizons of reader. Reader needs to step back. Yeah. So this domain of the reader needs to step back in order to make the context of the text itself appear better. So you have to make an conscious effort to step back from your own context in order to try and interpret a text out of its own context. Yeah? He's mid 20th century. So he also talked about the philological circle. He talked about canones or canoni. So there is four canones, and that is the canon of hermeneutical autonomy of the object. So we have to be careful that we don't read into meaning into a text, but extract it out of the text. He calls that sensus non inferendus sed efferendus, taking out. Then there's the canon of the nexus of meaning. So relating to the philological circle. So you need to look. You cannot just extract one little unit and make it absolute, like the sodomy laws in Leviticus, were basically really in the context of apostasy, of leaving the one God, because you had temple prostitution in the Canaanite religions practiced next to Israelite religion. And so if you don't understand this word in Hebrew, what is translated as abomination, what this means is falling away from the one true God by, for instance, visiting a Canaanite temple. So it's not about sex, but it is about being true to your faith group. So that is the context here. Still you can say, well, that's a bit narrow and so on. You can still disagree with that, but then at least you say, well, that the Leviticus people, they didn't want to their focus were not legislating sexuality or the way people clothe, because in the same verse you should not have mixed fibers. Again, that was something that Canaanites did. Yeah? So it was all about group identity. Don't visit the temple with the temple prostitute. don't wear the clothes that the Canaanites do, because you're marking yourself as not member of the tribe that believes in the one true God. That's the context. If you don't understand that, you just read something and you make that into something completely different. The discourse. So that's the nexus of meaning, and then there's the canon of actuality of understanding, where you try to reconstruct the creative process. That a meaning that is close to the context of the textual when the text came into being versus its actual significance for the reading. Well, there's 3 canons. I thought it was 4, but it doesn't matter. Okay. Now clearly moving on into philosophical hermeneutics, we come to the Frankfurt school, right? And we have people here like Habermas putting something really important into all these kind of more epistemological, hermeneutical approaches, and that is power. Well, power is maybe too Foucauldian a word. Let's say with Habermas, interest. What is the interest? Where are the functions? Function above, you could say, function above content, or function above purported substance, right? As a good pedagogist, I might lie to you, because the function of the lie is actually to push you closer to the truth. So if you take everything I say on face value, or as a good therapist, as a good psychologist, as a good writer, you have this phenomenon of the unreliable narrator. Wow. That has a function. So in other words, we need to take interest into account. We need to look at underlying ideology. Yeah. So who benefits? Who has the power? Who has an interest? What is the dynamic here? I always like to point, as a classicist, on this wonderful court plaidoyer. Court speech pro Roscio that Cicero did as a defense lawyer, where he which is basically the main argument that you find in any police drama, in any crime, true crime, and so on. It always comes down to this question that he repeated over and over and over in his defense speech for Roscius. Who is it actually who benefits from the crime committed? Or in Latin, qui bono? To whom is the benefit? Otherwise, sometimes follow the money, follow the money, follow the who's it. And that is 80 before Common Era. Qui bono? Qui bono? You need to ask. That's basically what Habermas in the 1950s, Frankfurt School of Critical Theory did. So, I want to introduce this pet, little pet of me, pet thing of me, this little ingredient, what we might want to call exegetical fussiness. If we understand that we have a horizon of the reader and a horizon of the text, then we also need to add yet another layer, and that is the horizon or the context, you can also say context, of the process itself. Because as an interpreter, I'm also not stable. Look at my writings 10 years ago, So stupid, I say the same thing in 10 years about what I'm writing now. People change, their opinion change, their context change. Look at the emails you write when you're angry and the emails you write when you had a good night's sleep. Or the emails you write when you're drunk, which I don't know because I don't drink, but I've been told people do that. So everything changes in context, in small time, in long time. We are naive in different ways when we're young, and when we're middle age, when we're entering old age, and so on. So there is a flux and a development, and to reflect on that actually is very important. When I send my students to do field work, so I have some people who do ethnography also, I ask them always to do not only a fieldwork diary, where they collect the data and so on, but also a personal diary. Because I want them at some point, when they have really significant data, qualitative data, I want them to go back to their personal diary that day and check what was your state of mind when you were interviewing this person and so on. All this kind of thing. It's very important. So you need to take that into consideration. So you get an ever-changing and ever-exchanging, you could call it fluid, triangulation of subject, object, and process all the time. And to be reflexive about that is very, very important with all kinds of interpretative work. Okay. Wow. Okay, I'll go a little bit on, but we are almost finishing because we only have 1.5 hours, right? So we have philosophical hermeneutics in stricto sensu is what we find with Heidegger and Gadamer. Don't have so much time to focus on that, but if you want, you can read a little bit about, look up in a nice good lexicon or so on, hermeneutics, philosophical hermeneutics. Heidegger's understanding of Dasein, of being in time, and so on. This can shed some more light on the principles that I try to convey, or in Wahrheit und Methode, Truth and Method by Gadamer. I think just picking out of what is important is that language being mimesis and lie at the same time also means it always is open already and asks for, but also intrinsically contains exegesis or hermeneutics. Because language, or you could say text or speech, is from Plato, is mimesis, imitation of reality, but also lie at the same time. It's incomplete and deceptive imitation of reality. It always also already contains and asks for and contains exegesis. It is both a product of exegesis itself, and asks for exegesis. That is what basically Gadamer's argument when he talks about open text. Heidegger was Gadamer's teacher, right? So Gadamer, Heidegger writes beautiful and terribly complicated. I love it. A German native speaker, you read it, it's wonderful, but it's almost mystical. And then Gadamer has a very, very clear style. So in many ways, Gadamer, in a sense, is a translator, an interpreter, and hermeneutica of Heidegger, right? And this, so he develops this idea of open text on the basis of Heidegger, the text that is an interpretation, but also asks for interpretation, right? And whatever you arrive at meaning or understanding, that is then the achievement of this discourse mediated by language. No? So if I give you a hermeneutics or an interpretation of a painting, of music or text, this means that is my way of fusing the horizon of the text with the horizon of the reader. So, but the text itself never exists if nobody is there to read. All right? So every time somebody reads the text, this happens. All right? And in a sense, what you can do is it can look at how coherent this meeting is, or how incoherent, or you can simply look, okay, this is how they use it and so on. It's depending what you want in your research, what your research question is. But you can never say true or false in that sense. Like if it's a fact, you can say less coherent and more coherent, right? Or less likely or less far-fetched. And this is the same when you correct essays by students. You cannot say wrong or right. I mean, unless in the most extreme cases, maybe you can say, well, this is verging on wrong as an interpretation. But you can say, well, okay, here's a flaw in your argumentation. And here is something that is not quite coherent. This is how this meeting was unsuccessful. You know, like you have a romantic meeting and the fumbling doesn't quite work because you're somehow incompatible or you're doing weird things, you know. So that is what you can say. Do we need to adduce authenticity in terms of Heidegger with that or not? I mean, there can be, if we talked about this Christian fundamentalist or literalist, there can be huge authenticity in these meetings, but you can still show that there is not much coherence there. So there's a difference between like coherent let's keep it with coherent meetings of the horizons with what people feel or perform as authenticities. Because that is a much more that can be interpreted as an inward quality. Yeah? So from an incoherent meeting of the horizons of the text and the reader, still a sort of an authentic performance can arise. Yeah? But as scholars, obviously, what we are interested in is to explore how these horizons meet also. You know, and how to reflect on, depending on our research system. So it is therefore what Gadamer shows is this is therefore quite important to understand the history of the reception of a text. You know, so unraveling the different contexts of interpreters who read a text through certain agendas and certain biases and certain historical and social contexts. I would say, as an artist or as a writer, you create what you create for yourself is only the first interpretation of something, or your interpretation of something, which is authentic to you, but you don't have the right to then say, well, this is the meaning. When I write a poem and I give it to people to read, the moment I give a poem to somebody to read,
another meaning.
I have let go of my power. I still have the right to be identified as the author, but I don't have the hegemony or monopoly of meaning anymore. And also, I know from my own poems, they shift in meaning biographically. Poems I wrote 20 years ago mean something very different to me than what they meant to me 20 years ago. And So it's this letting go. It's this letting go, yeah. And it's probably the same when you paint and when you write music and so on, or you do creative writing, not poems also. So I think that is something good to reflect upon. A piece of art, whether or any text, even a speech act, when we talk to each other, it's the moment, because it's relational. We only have the power over our side of the relation to a degree. But where there's a meeting between horizons and a fusion, we cannot claim supremacy. If we try to do that and control that, the authors tried to do that, of course. They destroyed, they annotated their fieldwork and so on, and they sanitized their accounts and whatever, But if they're unsuccessful in that, and you still don't have control. You still don't have control. So in that sense, we need to have this, bear with this tension that the creative act, whether it's speaking or making music or whatever it is, to a certain degree is always out of control, always fluid, and that meaning is always both achievable and unachievable. Both achievable and unachievable. So there's always only the multiplicity. So this. So but let's conclude with reflecting on our research then, and on going back all the way to Nietzsche, the myth of objectivity, which should be a commonplace by now. By now, everybody should know that there is no objective truth, at least not one that we can adequately formulate in whatever way. So once we understand that, then our research will become reflexive and open. We will not take the results of our research so serious to the degree that we will claim complete supremacy over the subject. Rather, we will reflect on our own position and offer something to other fellow researchers and readers as one plausible way of reading something that is authentic to us and hopefully connects with some authenticity in the reader. And when as scholars we look at work, even as the masterpieces, which are the PhDs, what we need to look at is the rigor and the coherency of the argumentation and the level of complexity that somebody can hold in their research and the level of originality of their ideas that they can actually interweave with rigorous contextualizations and interpretation. And that is what we're looking for. And not whether questions of right or wrong or to which school of thought somebody believes. I mean, I always foster my students to the way to encouraging them to refute me as much as possible and to have different opinions from me as much as possible, because I'm very much interested how they arrive to that. And actually I learn a lot of the loopholes in my own thinking, and I can close them. Often not, and I have to change my thinking is also okay. Yeah, I do that all the time. So this is why I don't like to read things I wrote 10 years ago, because there's so much nonsense in there, But anyway, so let's be true. Think about then truth as something that is less clear cut, that can have a factual element to it as much as if there is something like objective facts. We know from history or from constructing historical facts that they're also less true always, or less factual than we think they are. But generally it's good to think more about meaningful. What is meaningful? True as something that is meaningful in a given context, time and place. Yeah. So, so in that sense, what we are doing is we are looking at sources in their contextual meaning and function, not forgetting our own context and our own place and our own shifting place and the process itself. Yeah. Which basically makes it all very, very complex and messy. If you came to academia thinking, I want to create order in the chaos of my knowledges, go away. You should rather subscribe to some gratifying conspiracy theory, because that gives you much more order in the messiness of your thinking. Real scholarship will make your knowledges much more messy than they were before. And you just have to enjoy. Become like the child in the chocolate factory, or you just throw everything, make a big chaos, a big mess, unapologetically, and be happy, and have no answers whatsoever, but you have a lot of nice flavors of chocolate around you. No answers, but nice chocolate. That is the aim of research. And with that I end. Thank you very much.